As I said today, the Associate Minister of Education, David Seymour, has announced in broad brush terms and with a budget of, I think, about 130 million, 153 million, the announcement of charter schools in this country as a suggestion that the mainstream education system doesn't suit all children, and that new forms of educating and schooling children with new ways of arranging themselves internally and new methods of instruction might be the way to go with the formation of charter schools dealing with groups of different people. This follows in the wake of 24 hours ago, the New Zealand Herald breaking a story from our next guest, a report overseen by the Education Hub, suggesting that we have we would have the largest number of neurodiverse children in our schooling system than we've ever had. That is estimated to be between 15 and 20% of the entire school population, which is a huge number, and that the system simply isn't coping with them. That's the mainstream system. Joining us to talk about both of those two issues, because they seem in a funny sort of way interrelated, is the founder of the Education Hub, Dr. Nina Hood, and she joins us now. Nina, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Michael. How are you?
I thought you'd retired.
I tried.
Oh, you're back, are you? You couldn't stay away.
No. I was always going to maintain a connection to the organisation, and this report had been a long time in the making. So, definitely not severed all my ties.
No, I smiled when I saw your name attached to it. I mean, Nina, she can't stay away. I'm glad you can't, though, just quietly. Listen, take us through the report's highlights, please, or lowlights, if you like. We've got a record number of neurodiverse children in New Zealand. Can you just explain, in layman's terms to us all, what is a neurodiverse child?
Sure. So it's someone whose mind functions differently to normal societal standards. So what we're talking about are children, or adults of course, who have conditions such as autism, ADHD, developmental coordination disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and a range of other conditions as well. And our best guess is that we're looking at about 15 to 20% of the population being neurodivergent. So it's not a small proportion of people.
No, and the central thesis, as I understand, of your report was that the mainstream education system or schooling system in this country, A, struggles to accept that those kinds of people exist in it, and then B, struggles to deliver a coherent curriculum to allow them to be educated. Is that right?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there's growing acceptance of neurodivergent children and neurodiversity. So I don't think it's fair to say that the system as a whole doesn't accept them. I think what we found in our report draws on the testimony of 2,400 people involved in the system. So parents, teachers and school leaders, neurodivergent students themselves, and people working in support services. And I think whilst, there is growing recognition, it's very clear that the system's just not set up to support these students with the resourcing or support that they need in order to thrive in school or in life more generally. And you're right that there are still far too many people across the system that don't have a good enough understanding of what neurodiversity is, how it affects people, or how they can best support these students.
I gave an illustration of my own child who's ADD, ADHD. He's a 15-year-old boy. He's now in year 11 at at an integrated school, and I talked about how yesterday when this issue came up, how my experience, and when I relayed it, I got an awful lot of messages back from people who'd had exactly the same experience with their children, was at the start of the year you go to the school teacher, whether it's at primary, intermediate or at secondary school, and you say to the teachers or teacher, my son or my daughter's slightly different, they do like this, and the teacher nods and says, oh yes, right, yes, thank you very much, and then for the rest of the year teaches them as if they're a normal member of the class, and when they act up, treats them in exactly the way that you would treat a naughty child. So there's no real acceptance in their day-to-day education that they do learn in a slightly different way. Is that a common experience, do you think, throughout New Zealand?
Unfortunately, it's a really common experience throughout New Zealand, and it was absolutely heartbreaking writing this report, because universally what people told us is that the system just doesn't work, and experiences, like you state, of trying to engage with schools and trying to talk to them about what neurodivergent children need, what would support them in the classroom, just isn't translating into the types of changes in teaching and learning, the types of resourcing and support being put in place to actually enable these children to succeed in school. So it's absolutely what we hear frequently. But I think it's also, whilst I do believe that there's more that teachers and schools could be doing, I think we've also got to realise that, in many instances, if you say have 30 children in a class, 5 or 6 of them may be neurodivergent, each with different conditions that are going to impact them in different ways. The ability of one teacher to be able to support the needs of all 30 students in that class with very limited resourcing is nigh on impossible. So we're asking them to do something that's just not possible. And I know that for myself, as the mother of a neurodivergent child, there is part of me that just feels guilty because of what I have to keep advocating for my son at school. And admittedly, he's at a school that is incredibly supportive and have gone out of their way to enter into partnership with us and to really create a very supportive environment. But I still feel guilty every time I have to go in and say, could you please try to do this? Or could we change this around so that this can happen?
Yeah, I know. I feel the same as you, because you're conscious of the fact that every additional moment that they spend on your child, that's the teacher, is a moment that they're taking away from the majority of the children who aren't neurodivergent and therefore aren't receiving the same amount of education as a consequence. I've got a question to ask you. Let's talk about solutions here. We know what the problem is. You've identified it. I think it's generally accepted, well, amongst parents, you and I, maybe, perhaps not by policymakers or educators in Wellington. Do they accept that there's a problem in the first place, do you think?
So, from the brief conversations I've had with the Education Minister about this issue, he does realise that there is an issue. And I think he's been told by a lot of teachers and school leaders that this is something that they're really struggling with. I think one of the issues is trying to actually really wrap your head around the extent of the issue. And part of that's because we just don't collect data on it. So we have no idea how many neurodivergent children there are across the school system.
Oh, we don't. So is that right? We actually don't. So I can measure the ethnicity of a child and whether or not they're a male or a female, and we test for, where they are against on the bell curve for PAT tests and things like that. But we don't actually gather that basic statistic of, do I have a neurodivergent, how many children who are neurodivergent in my school, and I don't actually know or define them what the neurodivergence is. Is that right?
That's correct.
That's just ridiculous.
Correct. So when you can't actually quantify an issue, it makes it doubly hard to advocate on it or to, show the importance of it.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but what have all those thousands of additional hires at the Ministry of Education been doing for the last 5 years?
You're not the only one to be asking that question. Not working on this is all I can say.
Right. Now, also the other thing you're talking about is you're talking about autistic kids. And boy, that covers a range of people from highly functioning to, frankly, needing to, have their pants changed for them. You're talking about ADD, again, that's an ADHD, again, that's on a scale as well.
Yeah.
You're talking about dyslexia. There were a couple of other words in that neurodiverse thing that I'd never struck before. Can you explain those to me, please?
Or some of those conditions?
Yes, please.
So, developmental coordination disorder, which
what's
is
that?
sometimes known as dyspraxia. So it's an issue with coordination. So both gross and fine motor skills. So a child with is shortened to DCD, will often have real trouble with fine motor skills. So things like handwriting are incredibly challenging for them. And it's because they know what they want to do. So they know they want to hold their pen with the correct pencil grip, and they know that they want to form the letter A, but their brain struggles to send those signals through down to their fingers to actually do those things. So, of course, for a child like that, being in a classroom can be incredibly challenging because anything to do with motor, spatial awareness, those sorts of things are a big challenge for them. I think one of the other ones I mentioned was dyscalculia. So that's someone who struggles with numbers and sequencing. So they're often going to struggle with mathematics and with a number of the processes involved in mathematics. We know that visual and auditory processing are another area of neurodivergence. They can quite commonly co-occur with other conditions as well. And so that also, again, is so for the auditory, it's someone who struggles to actually interpret what they're hearing. And for visual, again, it can be struggling with different aspects of visual tasks.